Chapter 1. Manhattan, 2123. Jarlath Keen's office at Sin Sound Corporation was in The Tower, which was the generally accepted term for the offices of the vice presidents. While Manhattan was its home and thus most lavish office, Sin Sound was a huge company with bases around the world. There were 34 other vice presidents in this building alone, and Keen felt a lot like one old goat in a herd of younger ones. That he was 5th or 6th from the top of the ladder, depending on whose head was on the hierarchy chopping block at any given time, rankled him constantly. As far as he was concerned, his title of Vice President of Music Development meant nothing more than the fancy brass nameplate on the wall outside his office door and the private secretary who sat at a desk nearby. Every important decision that cost over 2,000 credits still had to be submitted to someone else for approval. Dusk had fallen early tonight, brought on by a denser-than-normal layer of smog that mixed with the low-lying, dirty-looking clouds that spit a constant, gritty drizzle onto the miserable people stuck on the streets far below. 2 more stories up, and the floor-to-ceiling windows in Keen's office would have been blocked by the sickly mist that signaled the first of the clouds. As it happened, Keen could still see, lucky him, the MedTech building 3 miles away, the air encircling it cleared of vapor by the constant spikes of electricity that zapped through its private airspace, generated by a MedTech patented device that sterilized the air around the building's intake vents before it ever reached the precious lungs of its employees. When MedTech had first put their little toy into operation 6 years ago, the electrical noise and static feedback generated sound spikes on every master SynDisc in the recording studio at mid-level in the Sin Sound building during the first hour, and damn near wiped Sin Sound out. Only an emergency injunction had halted the Atmos sterilizer. The court battles had been hot, heavy, and expensive, and the outcome a split. MedTech could continue using its Atmos sterilizer. After all, it was only looking out for the health of its employees and the cleanliness of its medical testing facilities. But it was required to pay damages to Sin Sound for the re-recordings that were necessary. And before it could put its device back into use, it had to develop and install a force field system that would limit the electrical spikes that were output to its own grounds. Now the 2 companies were bitter rivals, and that suited Keen just fine. He hated them both. A knock and the sound of the oak-paneled door that led into his office being opened made him turn. "Yes?" "Damon Eddington is here to see you," his secretary Marcina said stiffly. A stout woman in her early 40s, she'd undergone a drastic change in her appearance last week. The previous reddish-brown page-boy hairstyle was gone, replaced by a style that was shaved and dyed black on the sides, then crowned with a mop of spring-tight orange curls. She might have had the skin on her face tightened, and she'd definitely revamped her wardrobe. Today's new outfit was a tailor-waisted, short-sleeved green suit that looked as if the clothes had shrunk a few sizes while she was wearing them. Completing the ensemble was a purple scarf tied around her pudgy neck and tucked into the collar of the jacket. The whole thing was atrocious. Thinking back, Keen was sure she'd done it to look more attractive, perhaps thinking that he would finally afford her more than his work-related attention. Not a very pretty woman to begin with, Keen thought that Marcina now looked like one of those antique squashed-faced dolls that had recently become popular again and were now soaring in price. The idea that this had been her goal all along nearly made him chuckle aloud. In any event, when he hadn't commented on her new look, Marcina's demeanor had gone from polite to cool, edging on frosty. What did she expect? That he would ask her out on a date? Not likely. Keane was a fit and healthy 52, going on 30. He tried to feel pity for her, but couldn't. The truth was, he had more female companions than he knew what to do with already, and not one of them was over 25. Did she really think she could compete? Her constant attempts were annoying. With Marcina standing in his office door as the go-between for him and Damon Eddington, it seemed like the perfect time to give her a reintroduction as to who gave the directives around here. "I'll be with him as soon as I can." He purposely turned his back on her and went back to gazing out the window. "He's quite upset," Marcina said, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. Keane wanted to grin, but didn't. The reflection might give him away. "I said I'll be with him as soon as I can." He intentionally let a note of nastiness cut through his words. Another moment of hesitation, then he heard the door close and let the smile flow over his mouth. Let her deal with Damon Eddington for a quarter of an hour, he thought. She wasn't a stupid woman, and she'd know it was Keane's way of chastising her. Still smiling, Keane went to his desk and began clearing it of the Dupladroids Incorporated contract and acquisition proposal form. It wouldn't do to have Damon glance down and see that SynSound was paying a single Mutadroid manufacturer more than 1 million credits to recreate a band called Jane's Addiction in time for the quarter-century mark in 2 years. With the evidence cleanly swept into the top drawer, he spent a few minutes tidying the contents of the other drawers in his desk. Then, finally, sat back on his chair to wait. The minutes ticked by, and Keane fought the urge to laugh aloud. He could well imagine what was going on in the secretarial suite outside his office. "What's taking so long?" Damon Eddington demanded. He leaned on the secretary's desk, seeing her pull back nervously. "I thought the purpose of an appointment was to schedule time to talk to someone, and Keane said he would see me, damn it!" "And so he will, Mr. Eddington." The woman's voice was honey smooth, utterly professional. "Please just wait. I'm sure he'll be ready any minute." "Fine." Damon spun and strode back to the fake leather couch, resisting the urge to kick at the fancy coffee table in front of it. The thing was metal and glass, and he could picture the surface shattering and magazines flying everywhere. Another temper tantrum traceable to the not-so-legendary Damon Eddington. Instead of lashing out, he flounced onto the couch, watching the secretary for any sign that Keane was calling for him. When nothing happened after another 10 minutes, Damon dug his flask out of one of the pockets of his vest and took a small swig of sweet blackberry brandy, let it roll over his tongue, and momentarily take his mind off how insulted he felt. This was a game to Keane, he was sure, but for what purpose? SynSound, with Jarlath Keane at the reins, already led him around by the proverbial nose. As far as Damon was concerned, forcing him to sit out here like a fool showed that, among other things, Keane was possessed of a deep and despicable streak of meanness. The secretary, he couldn't remember her name, had probably been told to stall him for as long as she could. For all Damon knew, she might have been told to keep him out here until he gave up and went away. His lip curled. Not likely. Damon took another swig of brandy and screwed the top back on the plastic flask, then tucked it back into his pocket and forced himself to relax against the softness of the couch. As always, his mind was full of music, a dark composition of his own making that had been in the process of a slow and painful birth since the reviews of his last small concert had been printed on the news discs. After a few more minutes, he dug inside another pocket and pulled out his portable recorder. If Keane was going to waste Damon's entire day by making him wait outside his office door, then Damon would try to use the time as best he could. After all, the secretary was a built-in audience. He hummed a few notes, then a few bars, letting them swirl like discordant shadows in the air as he warmed up his vocal cords. Already the woman was frowning at him, but he paid her no attention. What did her opinion matter when the rest of the world seemed to hate his creativity more? In the scheme of Damon's life, Keane's secretary was nothing. Stretching his voice and losing himself in the sounds and tones, the pitch of his voice rising and falling until it flowered in full song. Not words, but a sort of drawn-out vibration that was as true as he could make it to the original source. The dying wails of jelly junkies in detox centers. Now the secretary's face was scrunched up in revulsion, her head sinking low on her shoulders like a turtle trying to escape an attacker. As Damon's voice, a decent baritone in itself, grated the next experimental lyric into the microphone embedded in the recorder, he saw her snatch up the telephone receiver on her desk and punch repeatedly at a button on the intercom. He smiled to himself. He didn't have to stop singing to know what she was saying. When she got up and came over to where he sat on the couch, her back was rigid and there were beads of perspiration high on her forehead, just under the line of burnt orange curls. Damon was pleased that his music had affected her. It didn't matter that she didn't like it. He'd take whatever results he could get. "Mr. Keane, we'll see you now," she snapped as Damon paused and looked at her questioningly. "You know the way?" That made Damon grin outright. The way. Oh yes, he sure did. Keane's way, Sin Sound's way, the way of trash as far as Damon was concerned. But it was useless to argue, especially with this nothing little woman, so he nodded and stood, putting away his recorder and ignoring her audible sigh of relief. She didn't bother to lead him to Keane's door, and Damon didn't expect her to. Keane's office was expansive and as tastefully furnished as the man himself was dressed. Damon didn't follow fashion much, but the Ricci Mate suit Keane wore was impossible to disregard, and no doubt the matching shoes were just as expensive. His glistening steel grey hair was impeccably styled, his exquisite hand-painted tie an insult to Damon's own well-cared-for but only moderately expensive Danforth padded vest. The man was obviously bathing in credits. Sin Sound was clearly making more credits than it knew what to do with. Why then did they fight for every credit on his contracts and make it so hard for Damon to draw a simple advance? Keane sat behind an immense maroon plexiglass desk, cleared of almost everything, but there were too many gold and platinum sound discs framed on the walls to maintain an illusion of a man with a multitude of leisure time on his hands. Row after row hung in expensive teak frames, with one wall almost covered, and Keane himself, smug, sleek, and ever patient. He had the look of a man who had resigned himself to the tedious chore of dealing with another annoyance in his life, and had dubbed himself a martyr for his tolerance. Even his voice was carefully modulated, without the slightest hint of inflection. "What is it now, Damon?" The old Damon Eddington, the man he'd been before being suffocated by Sin Sound for so many years, would have turned and walked out, after telling Keane to sit on it and spin. No, the old Damon Eddington would have walked out of the waiting room 3/4 of an hour ago. The present Damon Eddington walked in with his head bowed, as if deep in thought, with his hands crammed into the loose-fitting blue jeans that were his everyday uniform, watching his feet work their way across the perfect carpet as though the sight were the most important thing in the world. He sat on the chair in front of Keane's desk without comment, And when he finally looked up, his dark eyes were soft, his vision focused on something far away that only he could see. "I want an alien." The double take Damon expected never came. Keen didn't even blink. The executive's hands remained folded calmly on the desk's highly polished surface, the reflection below his fingers making him look like some double-handed android built to play a newly invented hell rock instrument. "You want an alien," Keen repeated. Damon squelched the impulse to remind Keen that this wasn't a psychiatric bull session where the doctor repeated everything the patient said to make sure he had understood it clearly. "Let's see," Keen continued. "You're not into weapons, so that's out. You're not into medicine or drugs either. That puts those out of the picture. So exactly what do you need an alien for, Damon?" Damon spread his hands, unconsciously willing Keen to understand, to show the slightest trace of empathy. "For the sound." The last word carried on the filtered air of the office like a drawn-out whisper, a sibilant floating in the air that teased both of them. Finally, a reluctant crack in Keen's disposition as the older man unwillingly bonded with Damon's dreams for an instant, hearing, as the eccentric artist did, the alien singing from its steel throat and screaming with a tongue of acidic flame. Damon's words faded away as he and Keen stared at each other. Bitter memories flash-danced in Damon's head as he waited for Keen's decree, and he remembered the first time an alien's screams had ever found their way into his ears. It had been on a vidscreen in a store window, a newsvid item from Channel 86 about an infestation in the Long Island incarceration colony. Sensationalist crap designed solely to grab the passerby and glue them to a vidscreen. And it had worked on Damon, though not for the reasons the media planners might have anticipated. The footage had shown a clot of aliens bunched in a sub-basement of the LIIC's main prison, on the defensive against an army troop wearing suits constructed of the same material that labs used to store acid, and bearing flamethrowers loaded with long-burning jellied napalm. To Damon, the creature's screams had translated to one thing, unadulterated or diluted: hate. And Damon hated so very, very much. How many reviews had slammed his work as tiresome or obscure or, worst of all, boring? The reviewers detested him. The public ignored him. Sin Sound humored him. All the while he struggled on, desperately trying to reach a public that seemed to want only hell rock or blood rock or, God help them, android singers and performers so mutated that they had 4 arms, multiple heads, and mouths coming out of their mouths in a twisted parody of aliens. The closest John Q. public came to exposure to the gentler sounds of the past was, again, in recreated androids. Before dwindling into ambiguity, Elvis Presley's duplicate had piqued enough interest to gain a hall named after it, and Caruso's fabricated double sang for the upper class every night at the New Met Opera House. A steady trickle of credits from the older generation supported Sin Sound projects like Buddy Holly Sings Garth Brooks 3, and thousands of other re-recordings of centuries dead artists. Androids of Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, Charlie Parker, Clifford Brown, Richie Valens, Dwayne Allman, John Lennon, Patsy Cline, and others regularly belted out new hits. And Sin Sound, owner of practically every piece of music and musician in the world, including Damon, sat above it all with people at its helm like Jarlath Keen, a man with virtually no imagination, no vision. As far as Damon was concerned, the stages of Presley Hall were the Manhattan home of hell on earth, filled with appallingly re-engineered mutadroids that were half android, half mutated instrument, surrounded by the dregs of humanity who flocked to listen to the groups. Few people appreciated Damon's careful, live recordings of serious music. The darker blends from wonderful classic composers like Beethoven, Paganini, Mozart, Vivaldi, Bach. So much beautiful music recorded on rare 20th century instruments, violins, harps, dulcimers, all expensive and a struggle to come by. Synsound again indulging him, using him as a pawn to show the world how it sponsored and supported what remained of the arts while it survived, prospered, on the ridiculous, discordant trash for which the people of this century constantly clamoured. He hated Synsound almost as much as he detested the concert goers who appreciated only torture and terror, responded only to the grotesque, frightening androids cavorting and screaming on the stage. If what they wanted was hate and pain and the repulsive, Damon decided, he would give them exactly that. The press conference he'd called was only a stage for him to announce to the country and every place the news vid would carry the story about how much he hated John Q. Public, Synsound, everything. His tirade against Synsound and its customers had gone on for as long as he dared before he feared the media would turn away in boredom. For you all, for Synsound, he'd railed into their microphones. I will write the ultimate composition, a symphony of hate. Afterward, his employer smiled its corporate face and nodded, pleased at the attention its pet artiste had generated, and shrugging off Damon's anger with a humorous attitude. He was an artist, after all. They were supposed to be temperamental, angry, excitable. It was those very feelings that made them creative. Damon's work on his masterpiece had carried him everywhere. No place was too dark or dangerous. He visited madhouses, prison wards, even execution chambers, where he watched killers leave this world shrieking in rage. A favorite haunt was the downtown government detox center, where the screams of jelly junkies bruised the eardrums and forced the workers to wear hearing protection. But it was the news item that made Damon search the sound library for vid discs from the Homeworld War of 10 years ago. The poor quality and low fidelity of the military recording devices didn't matter. The screams of the aliens as they fought and were destroyed blasted through Damon's senses like electricity, burning his mind, stealing his breath. No one and nothing else in the world sounded like an alien. Nothing. And nowhere else did the creature's shrieks of malevolence belong more than in Damon Eddington's Symphony of Hate. And here Damon sat, once again at the mercy of Synsound's whim. Why don't you use the sound from the vid discs? It's the obvious answer. Keane sat back and studied Damon Eddington. While he was tall and medium built instead of skinny and starving, Damon still unwittingly fit Synsound's policy of how one of their stable of unorthodox musicians should look. His receding hair was as black as crude oil and pulled back from his high forehead into a thin ponytail. Dark eyebrows arched sharply over darker eyes, and his long face ended in a double-cut goatee that grew to a good 2 inches beyond the end of his chin. Keane already knew what the musician's answer would be, and he kept his expression carefully bland while he waited for Damon's words. Because it's crap, Damon said in disgust. Don't you realize what the army battalions were using? We're talking about the government here. They had handheld recorders. For God's sake. Obsolete magnetic tape and microphones with plastic screens over them to keep the battleground dirt out of the electronics. Plus, every recording is undercut with tank and weapons fire. Explosions that muddy up everything. I can't re-record that rubbish. I need clear, crisp sound. Presence, Jarlath. I want it to sound like the alien itself is standing in front of the mic and roaring at it. Keen rubbed his cheek and tried to look thoughtful. Damon was such an easy toy, up and down, like those ancient yo-yos that 20th century children had played with. Then we'll synthesize it for you. As he'd expected, Damon looked horrified. Up and down. You've got to be joking! Damon balled his fist and held it up. You know I hate synthetics. It's got to be live. I won't put any of that electronic mishmash into my music. He looked at his fist and relaxed his fingers, as if just discovering his own hand. Keen could see the composer visibly trying to calm down. Listen, Jarlath. This is my masterpiece, the epitome of everything I've ever done. I want to do it all myself, even down to recording the alien screams. And for that, I need one of those creatures alive. A real alien. I see. Keen let Damon dangle for a moment, then gave him a narrow-eyed stare. What you're telling me, Damon, is that you want SynSound to spend vast amounts of money to illegally procure an alien for you so that you can use that same creature to create a musical work that will show the world how much you hate us. Damon wasn't fazed. Exactly. But you'll do it anyway, won't you? He folded his arms and leaned back. You have to admit that I'm a constant source of advertising, even if you and your company don't appreciate my hard work. Ah, such smugness from a man who was too arrogant to realize he was nothing more than a child under SynSound's disciplinary lash. Keen leaned back himself and waved a hand. Spend vast amounts, Damon. Hardly. As a reminder, we have an advertising department with budgets and corporate mandates, remember? Forgive me for pointing out that they can handle publicity far more pleasantly than you can. In the end, I'm afraid you're a low-priority item. I'm limited as to how much I can spend to indulge your inventive aspirations, no matter how far-reaching you believe they will be. The methods by which we can obtain for our little pet, you, his own little pet, are severely curtailed by budget factors. He was rewarded by the insulted scowl that spread across the musician's face. Funding an expedition to Homeworld is certainly out of the question. Keen continued, ignoring Damon's offended expression. Bribing the military is always possible, but again, far too expensive. Too many hands in the financial pie would have to be filled. Still, he said slowly, as the image of a taller building surrounded by the bright beauty of jagged electrical flashes a few miles away filled his mind. There may be a way. He smiled for the first time since Damon had come into his office. I'll see what I can do. Knowing the meeting was over, Damon stood and spread his hands. It just won't work otherwise. I need it, Jarlath. The symphony. It will be a big hit. You'll see. Goodbye, Damon. Keen folded his hands on the desktop again, a clear signal that his patience was at the breaking point. For a second he thought Damon would protest. Would he actually beg this time? But no, while the musician looked like he wanted to, eventually he turned his back and walked out, his angry footsteps making muffled thunks against the carpeting. As soon as the office door closed behind Damon, Keen swung to the vidphone on his desk. He gave it about 30 seconds. Enough time for Damon to walk through his secretary's area and turn into the hallway leading to the elevators. Then buzzed Marcina. Yes? She sounded as worried as she looked on the monitor, as though he might send her after Damon with instructions to bring him back. Keen liked to hear the note of anxiety in her voice. It kept her respectful. "Get me Yoriku," he said simply. He didn't wait for a reply before snapping off the connection. 12 minutes. Keen tapped his fingers on the desk and counted each movement of the LED clock display, one by one, as they flashed by. Amazing. How could he forget the time he failed to answer a summons from Yoriku's assistant for half an hour? Keen had been in the midst of a delicate contract negotiation with one of the country's hottest new stars, and felt it was unwise to give the woman and her agent time alone to pick through the contract undisturbed. Everything he'd done back then had been for the good of SynSound. Every waking hour was spent contemplating ways to better the company and his position in it, and increase those corporate profits to the parent. How bewildered he'd been to subsequently find himself with instructions to proceed to a tiny city called Black Lake in the Canadian province of Saskatchewan. Once there, he was ordered to personally supervise the relocation of a Canadian lyric writer to Manhattan. Keen, a so-called high-level vice president, was being used by Yoriku as a damned travel escort. Finally, the private incoming light on the vidphone flashed. "What is it, Keen?" Yoriku's face filled the screen, wavering with static. Despite MedTech's force field, the phones had done that intermittently since the Atmos sterilizer was put into use, something in which Keen took secret, perverse pleasure. "It's about Damon Eddington, sir." On the screen, a corner of Yoriku's mouth turned up slightly. "He is an amusing man." The emotion disappeared as quickly as it had come, and Yoriku's broad face smoothed out again. Keen made himself smile in return. "Yes, sir, he is funny. Very funny. In fact, after our conversation, you may think he's even funnier. It seems that Eddington has come up with an unusual idea concerning the project he's working on. You remember that, I'm sure. His Symphony of Hate. He visited me a short while ago with a request. It's quite original. I don't believe anyone else has ever asked for this." And Keen recounted everything about his conversation with Damon, embellishing where he felt it was necessary to ensure he maintained Yoriku's attention. At the end of Keen's narrative, Yoriku shook his head. His voice grated through the vidphone speaker, like old rust being wire scrubbed off a steel beam. He had been in the United States for decades, but his words still carried a heavy Japanese accent. "It is impossible to get Eddington this alien for what I am willing to spend on him." Keen let himself grin widely. He was quite pleased with the scheme he had come up with, practically as Damon had been speaking. Not many people would have been so quick on their mental feet. "Not necessary, sir. I believe I have a solution. It will be risky, but..." Yoriku started to shake his head again, and Keen risked interrupting him, trusting that his next words would instantly smother any annoyance his poor manners raised. "Of course, it would involve, med tech." Yoriku's image froze for a moment. In what way? His voice, not particularly pleasant to begin with, dropped lower as his thin eyes narrowed all the way to slits. So Keen told him his plan in all its exquisite, deceitful detail, setting times and listing the equipment required, what other things and who would be needed to see it through, fine-tuning the details as he went. So that's it. Keen finished a short while later. What do you think, sir? Are we in a position to humiliate MedTech? The answer was obvious as Yoriku's mouth spread in a smile that reminded Keen of the dangerous, toothy grin of a hyena. Keen had heard the rumors, but hadn't dared call attention to himself by acknowledging the stories or asking anyone else in the company if they were true. Now Yoriku's black expression confirmed them all. One of the most powerful men in the world, yet he had lost the thing most precious to him, his exquisite, legendary lover. It had taken so long to happen that Keen had begun to believe that the woman had lied to him. But, finally, the whispered stories said that Mina now graced the bed of a younger, high-powered executive at MedTech. We are indeed in such a position, Keen. Yoriku unexpectedly pushed his face close to the video screen. On Keen's end, it looked as if the man had snatched up the phone and pressed his nose against it. Keen could see the pores in the man's skin. It was totally disgusting. And I want them to know it was sin sound. Not right away, but eventually. Is this clear? They will, sir. Keen tried to make his voice as soothing as possible. When Eddington's Symphony of Hate is released, there will be no mistaking the origin of the sound. Yoriku backed away from the screen, looking pleased. As the Japanese man leaned back and rested his hands on the arms of a chair that was no doubt real leather, Keen was again reminded of the hyena, this time with a full belly. I will need assistance, Keen hinted slyly. Someone to... You may send for Ahiro. I will instruct him to be at your disposal in all respects. Excellent. But Yoriku had already disconnected, leaving Keen to glare at the static on the vid screen and grit his teeth for a moment before he buzzed Marcina again. Up and down, he thought. We all play the game. Problem was, he hated being the one spinning on the end of Yoriku's yo-yo. Yes, Mr. Keen? Find Ahiro and send him up. He didn't give her a chance to question the order, taking his cue from the way Yoriku had cut off their own conversation. He didn't want to listen to her whine anyway. Perhaps she'd been with him too long, with Sin Sound too long. All she did was complain about having to do things she didn't like or thought were beneath her job duties. Did she think he would hire an assistant to work for her as well? Not likely. More waiting, but at least when he got there, Ahiro would be much more respectful than Keen's secretary was. Keen didn't like working with the man and would have preferred to find someone else, but he had to admit that he'd never encountered anyone like Ahiro, who damned near treated Keen's words as God's own. Well, not really. The top command, of course, was Yoriku. There was a connection between Yoriku and Ahiro about which Keen remained utterly clueless, and all his careful inquiries had dead-ended. The inquiries themselves had been dangerous, and he'd been meticulous in his efforts to make them appear nothing more than a healthy curiosity about the man who owned the company for which Keen worked. Useless effort, wasted time. The slender Japanese man with the grave expression slipped around the corporate headquarters with barely a word to anyone and free access to anywhere in the building. And whatever the tie between Yoriku and Ahiro was, it would not be shared with Keen or anyone else of his ilk. Keen stood and cracked his knuckles thoughtfully as he stepped to the window and stared out. Secrets. Secrets everywhere around him. They made him nervous, curious, crazy with wanting to know them all. He'd have to work harder on this thing between Yoriku and Ahiro later on, perhaps next summer, after his first round of questions had been forgotten and a new staff was settled in place inside Yoriku's private offices. Turnover was a constant in a company this size, especially after the raises and disappointments each spring. There were those inside who could be bought, true. The ones like Yoriku's personal executive assistant and file manager, who had been with him for something like 15 years. Unlike Marcina, however, that woman had an assistant, several in fact. When Keen had built his savings back up to speed, he would go to work on those two, as he had on Mina. Keen didn't know how, but the next time he glanced away from the window, a mere 3 minutes later, the mysterious Japanese man with the ragged scar across his right eye was standing in front of the desk.